Can I just ask you all as you're logging in, if you wouldn't mind just changing your names, so we've got your full name and the institution that you're calling in from, please? Right, it's 11 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see so many people here on this call. My name is Claire, I'm the events officer here at the EAUC. I'll be hosting today's webinar, but most of the talking will be done by Duncan. You've got all your microphones are currently on mute, so if you could just keep them on mute just to keep any background noise to a minimum so we can hear what everyone's saying. Could I also just ask again, if you could just right click on your names or hover over your names and click on them, you'll see a little option to rename. If you wouldn't mind, please just popping your full name and the institution that you're calling in from. That would be really helpful so we can see who's on the call. And also if you've got any questions later on, that's also just really helpful to know who is on the call and what, where you're calling from. We are recording today's session and we will make the recording available on the Sustainability Exchange for you once we're finished. So we're going to hand over first to Duncan. Duncan's the Chief Data Officer at Times Higher Education. I know you want to hear all about how they rank you. So I'm going to pretty much just hand over to him, and then once he's finished talking you through the methodology, will be a chance for you to answer all your questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Duncan tell you all about it. Duncan.
So Claire, thank you very much for the introduction, and hello to everyone. My name's Duncan Ross. I'm actually here in London for once, which seems very, very strange coming back into an office after so long. I am the only person in the office, however. So thank you for joining. Top tip, by the way, don't forget that the name that you change on your Zoom to now will stay with you whenever you reuse Zoom. This is particularly relevant if you go into pub quizzes and then come out and back into a professional context. So today I'm going to be taking you through the impact rankings methodology and really trying to give you an insight into both what we're trying to achieve and the approaches we're taking towards it. We've got hopefully plenty of time for questions at the end. A really good way to ask questions, by the way, is to put them either into the chat or if Q&A is available. I don't know if it is on this particular version of Zoom, but if you put them into the chat as you think of them, then we'll try and make sure we get to those at the end. And of course, the slides I can absolutely make available to you as well. So I'm duty bound in my contract to start with a mission statement. Times Higher Education, as you know, has been around since 1971, starting off as a part of Rupert Murdoch's empire. Rupert got rid of us a while ago, but we've always been interested in the higher educator. And as Chief Data Officer, since 2015, we've been trying to gather more and more data to understand what universities and other higher education institutions have been doing. The main way we do that is through the rankings. Rankings both serve as a mechanism for trying to understand and position universities against each other, but also from our perspective in trying to gather data to understand what's going on in the wider sector. Traditionally, we've done that, and for the longest time, we've done that through the World University Rankings, which are focused on research-intensive institutions. So that is something that is relevant to most UK HEIs. You have to have at least 1,000 publications over a 5-year period to qualify. And because it's an international ranking, inevitably some of the things we choose to measure there are simpler than we would choose if we were looking at a single country approach. In 2015, we also started to explore teaching. We do that in 2 countries at the moment, in the US, through the US college rankings, which are published in the Wall Street Journal, and in Japan through the Japan University Rankings. But it became clear to us that we were really only looking at 2 of the 3 great missions of universities. And the third mission was around the idea of impact. So we started to do a data collection exercise back in 2017, where we were exploring, or trying to explore this from the perspective of innovation. And I think it would be fair to say that the data that we gathered was somewhat inconsistent. And I certainly didn't think it had a full enough perspective on what impact could mean. At the same time, I started exploring, well, were there other and better and more solid frameworks for interpreting what could be meant by impact? And I very rapidly came across the United Nations the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the thing that attracted me to the SDGs as a potential framework for measuring impact, the first one actually was very self-centered. It's that if I built out my own framework, then we would spend calls like this arguing about why my framework was wrong. Taking one that the United Nations had built shortcuts that argument. You can agree with it or you can disagree with it, but our governments have signed up to it. The second reason is that it puts sustainability within a very broad context. Essentially what it said is that sustainability isn't just something for global north institutions who have the benefit of the assets that they have taken from all over the world. It recognizes that development of the global south is important, but that development needs to be sustainable. And it also puts aspects of inequality at the heart of sustainability. So it became clear to me that this was a really very powerful framework that we could potentially use to understand university impact. Now, I'm sure, given the nature of this grouping, that you're all very familiar with the SDGs. There are 17 SDGs, 169 indicators, 223 unique targets. From our perspective, we decided that we wanted to build a measurement framework which was a one-to-one match to the SDGs. There is an argument to say, actually, you could group the SDGs in various different ways. We felt, for various reasons, that that probably wasn't the best approach on a global scale, because at that stage, you're making some decisions that particular SDGs interact more strongly with other SDGs than with the broad selection. And you also impose certain other sort of conceptual positions on top of that. So we decided we wanted to match those 17 one for one. And we started building out our own metrics. And of course, one of the challenges here is that the SDGs themselves aren't designed with universities in mind. In fact, I believe last time I read through them, I found mentions of universities explicitly once and higher education more generally, I think a second time, in all of the documentation. So we had to do this in a way that kind of interpreted the SDGs from the perspective of the higher education sector. And to help us do that, we built out a very lightweight theory of change. So for those of you who are familiar with the not-for-profit sector, UK charities, for example, theories of change are designed to be a very practical way that you can interpret the objectives of an organization in terms of how they could potentially deliver positive outcomes. And so the four aspects of the theory of change that we applied here were firstly around research. So there's no doubt that the research that a university does could have a direct impact on the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. If we think, for example, about research into battery technology, well, that would clearly drive towards the goal SDG 7, clean and affordable energy, and SDG 13, climate action. So research is the first component. The second component is something that I describe as stewardship, and this takes into account not just how universities look after their physical resources. So are you energy efficient in terms of your campus, in terms of the transportation you use, but also how you behave towards the human resources that you're responsible for, not just faculty, but also very importantly, employees and your students, and also the communities around you. The third aspect then is outreach. Universities do a huge amount of work with their communities, whether you define those communities locally, nationally, or even internationally. And we felt that this was both a mechanism for demonstrating impact, but also that this was typically underrepresented in other measurement frameworks. And the final aspect is around teaching. Clearly, there are direct ways that teaching can impact the goals. The production of professionals with health qualifications clearly directly affects SDG 3, good health and well-being. But also more generally, how universities are able to inculcate an approach towards sustainability in their alumni, which will enable them to take sustainability into their future careers, whatever they might be. So for each SDG, we tried to build out metrics which we could relate to this theory of change. And for example, around SDG 2, zero hunger, we have a series of measures there that look at research into hunger. In terms of stewardship, in this case, we focus on student hunger, the idea that no student should be forced to cut short their studies because of either their own hunger or alternatively hunger in their family. Outreach, we look at actions that the university might be taking directly, which would support action on hunger within their national context. And then finally, in terms of teaching, we look at the proportion of your graduates who have a degree in either agriculture or aquaculture, where there is a significant element of sustainability built into the course. Now, you can see from those that there are, for any particular university, there will be some of those areas where that university is stronger than in others. But because of the nature of the SDGs, because there are all 17, we think that actually that gives different universities with very different mission statements the ability to demonstrate excellence across the whole set of SDGs, even if in one particular SDG there may be structural issues caused by the nature of the university. Of course, in doing this, we had to think very carefully about the things we were measuring and how we chose to measure it. We acknowledge that actually pulling this data together for 17 SDGs is non-trivial. You saw on the earlier slide that I said we have in the region of 200 odd different things we may be asking you to measure. And one of the things we recognized very early on is that if we asked every single university to provide all the data for every single SDG, we would effectively be limiting this to only universities from the developed world, because it takes a lot of effort. You effectively need to have people whose job is collecting data in order to be able to do that. So instead, we took a decision that for the ranking to be, if you provide data for a single SDG, that's fine, we will rank you in just that SDG. But if you supply data for SDG 17, which is Partnership for the Goals, and any three others, then you can be included in the overall ranking. And we hope that this would minimize the requirement to provide data in order to participate. I also had an underlying theory that we would see different universities in different parts of the world, or indeed in different parts of the country, that would have very different focuses. It's not saying that all of the SDGs aren't important, but if you're a university in Kuala Lumpur, you may have a very different focus than a university in Manchester or a university in London or a university in the northeast of England. And I hope that I would see this in the data, and we'll see later on whether or not my hypothesis turned out to be correct. Another thing we had to do was think very carefully about the things we chose to measure. We acknowledged that we were coming to this although I have a multinational team, we're still being led by, for those of you who know me, I'm a tall white guy from the north of England. I bring into this process my privileges. And so we tried to listen very carefully to what universities and individuals told us, and we tried to act on that. And certainly, absolutely, if you look at the methodology and you think there are things we are measuring that we're measuring the wrong thing, or we're not measuring it in a way that makes sense to you, your university, or to another context, please do talk to us about it. We are very open to listening and trying to learn from the many contexts we see around the world. But there are some measures in there which we have deliberately biased against universities from the more affluent parts of the world. And this is because I think, particularly when we look at sustainability, there are times when we need to recognize that some of these measures need to reflect the need of the societies that universities are serving, rather than necessarily just representing a traditional view of equality. A good example of this would be when we look at the proportion of first-generation students. Now, this is a particular measure that I enjoy because I think it's a very good example of a measure that cuts across a number of issues of deprivation. So it is effectively an intersectional measure. Whether your access to university is limited because of gender, of ethnicity, of economic influences, it's a good measure of how well a university is trying to counteract those effects. But there's no doubt that a university in a country that has a massified or a universal higher education system, there are far fewer people who are potential first-generation students. Whereas if you're a university in a country such as Palestine or Afghanistan, then there is a far greater number of people who could qualify as first-generation students. So that particular metric is a good example of one which we're trying to balance more towards equity than traditional measures of equality. Now, for a few of the slides in here, I've put some of the changes that we are making or we are not making in this year's ranking. And the first thing to say is that although we have had some people who have suggested that we need to expand from SDG 17 and 3 to, say, SDG 17 and 4 or 5 SDGs, we're going to stick to 17 plus 3 for at least the next few iterations. We are still in a stage where we want to genuinely get universities from across the world to be able to participate and demonstrate the work they are doing around sustainability. So I mentioned that we create an overall ranking. How do we do that? Well, we take the score from SDG 17, and then we take the scores from the 3 other SDGs in which a university performs most strongly. So a university can submit to all 17, or they can submit to just SDG 17 plus 3 others, and in either case, they will get into the overall ranking. Because of the way we've designed this, we've ensured that the bibliometrics, so the research element, is consistent across, regardless of which SDGs you choose. It's always about a quarter of the ranking. This is far lower than it is in, for example, the World University Ranking, because although research is one of those 4 elements, it is not by any means intended to be the overarching one. Also, because SDG 17 is compulsory, we slightly reduce the percentage of SDG 17 in the overall score. It's 22%. The other 3 would be 26% each. Now let's explore how we measure some of these different elements. And the first thing to say is, well, how do we look at research? Because unlike in the World University Rankings, where we have a very traditional hierarchy of subjects that comes down, when we look at the SDGs, we need to have a different way of identifying what research is associated with each SDG. And so we've been working with our bibliometric partners, Elsevier, to identify effectively a keyword search which can be applied to their bibliometric dataset, Scopus, in order to identify the correct publications. Now, the work for this continues, and later on I will show you some links which will allow you to participate in that, or at least analyze how that is proceeding. But the idea is that we have this effectively search string for each SDG, And that gives us a set of documents. And then on top of those documents, we then apply a number of metrics. The simplest one is very easily, how many publications does your university produce? But then we also have other ones. For example, in SDG 3, good health and well-being, one of the measures we use is how many citations your university's research has in clinical guidance. So is your research directly informing the best practice in clinical care? One of the difficulties, of course, with the keyword search approach is that you get what data scientists tend to call type 1 and type 2 errors. Easier to think of them as false positives and false negatives. In other words, we will sometimes incorrectly identify a publication as being within the set when it shouldn't be. And sometimes we will also incorrectly exclude a publication from the data set. And that's an inevitable feature of this particular approach. Now, we are taking care to try and minimize the number of false positives and false negatives, but it will always be a balancing act, which is why it's really important that we allow universities to participate in this process of trying to identify the correct papers. Elsevier are working together with the Aurora network, which is a network of large European universities, and also with the University of Southern Denmark around this, but I know that they would appreciate further input. Another difference between this particular ranking and others is that we don't just look at pure numerical data. So traditionally, when we look at the World University Ranking, we ask you how many students you have, how many faculty you have, we calculate a student faculty ratio and so on. But here we also ask for concrete evidence of actions you are taking or of policies or behaviors. So how do we score that kind of evidence? Because this takes us into a realm of a much more qualitative assessment. Inevitably, because we're doing this across multiple different contexts, multiple different cultures, and multiple different languages, we've had to take a relatively straightforward and simplistic approach to this. So the first thing I would say is, if you tell us you do something, we will credit you for that. We believe that universities are trying to tell the truth. So the starting point is, if we ask you a question, so in this case, looking at SDG 11, do you provide public access to significant buildings in your university? If you say you do, we will give you a credit for that. We will then look at evidence that you have uploaded or supplied. And if that evidence is a very clear piece of evidence that shows how you provide access, we'll give you a full point. If it's more general, we'll give you half a point. And obviously, if it doesn't match the question, you don't score for that at all. So here, for example, a good piece of evidence might be a timetable for building openings. We will also give credit when that evidence is public. Two reasons for this. Firstly, it gives us greater confidence the evidence is correct, but also, and much more importantly, it means that you as a university are holding yourself accountable to the wider public. If you say your buildings are open from 9 o'clock on a Wednesday, and people turn up your buildings and they're not open, then clearly they are able to address you on that and directly confront you. We also then may ask for additional details. So in the case of policies, for example, we ask how old the policy is when it was last reviewed. And this allows us to allocate additional points where that's relevant. Now, this year, we've tried to make our evidence evaluation process more consistent. We had, I think, about 10 different ways of asking questions. We've tried to simplify that down to 1 or 2, partly for our convenience, but partly to make it more straightforward for universities. So let's look at a concrete example of this. This is looking at SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. Specifically, we're looking at the question around water in the community. So this is where we're asking for evidence about work that your university might be doing around provision of water, provision of resources around water in the community. And there's a particular question in there which asks about how your university is cooperating with local, national, or global governments on the issue of water security. And here's an example of a piece of evidence that was provided by the University of Waterloo in Canada. And they've answered this by showing a news article of work that their team was doing around the United Nations HLPF on sustainable development, specifically around the issue of water security. So this is a great piece of evidence. It's public evidence, shows what they've been doing. It shows that they are cooperating with global governments. Now, just to be clear, when we ask for evidence, we don't need you to provide every single piece of evidence that is relevant. What we ask for is one good example of the work you're doing. If to fully answer a question, you need to provide one additional piece of information, you can do so, but it's certainly not expected for every single question. So I thought it would be useful to look at one particular SDG in a little more depth and showcase the kind of questions that we're asking. You can, of course, download the full methodology for next year's ranking, and again, there should be a link for that later in the presentation, but this will give you an idea of the thought process behind the questions. In this case, I've chosen SDG 5, gender equality. And I think it's important to recognize why this is crucially important and why this is important in the context of universities. Gender inequality, as we've seen in the UK, you remember we passed the Equal Pay Act, I think it was in 1973, I was a little young then, when we started looking at actual pay equity and the pay equity gap. We saw that despite having had this law in place for over 40 years, we hadn't actually achieved the goal we'd set. So gender inequality is there across the world. It's even there in countries which think they've resolved it. And higher education has a crucial role to play in trying to address the issues around gender inequality. So what are the things that we've chosen to look at? Well, we've chosen to look at research, obviously. We're not just looking at measures around the research that's being done into gender inequality. We're also looking at the proportion of published papers that come from women in your university. Actually quite a tricky thing to measure, but we think we've got a reasonable handle on it. And the approach is definitely able to see the statistical differences. We then ask about the proportion of first generation women. So is your university reaching out and ensuring that women where no one in their family has, or in their immediate family has attended university before, are able to come to your university? Obviously, there are different strengths of the way we could ask that question. In an ideal world, what I would be looking for is are you the first woman from your family to attend university? Now, actually, that's a very difficult thing to measure internationally because for many universities, even measuring first generation populations is a new step. But it would be something I would like to move towards in the future. We then look at series of evidence about how your university is working to make sure that women can get access to your university, that they can get through your admissions processes, particularly in subjects where they may be underrepresented. And the next one is a really interesting one, the proportion of women in senior positions. One of the things we see, particularly in the research-intensive universities, is that this is an area where there is still potential for further work. In fact, when we looked at UK institutions, we saw an inverse correlation between their citation output and the number of women in senior positions. And that suggests that there are some questions to be asked of our most esteemed UK research institutions. And I suspect that that's true in many other countries as well. The admissions gender mix, so we do normalize this by subject, trying to ensure that women are appropriately represented in course material. And it's worth saying here, by the way, that we are bound by the approach that the United Nations has taken to this. And the approach the United Nations has taken is very much that this is about the underrepresentation of women. It is not about situations where there is an underrepresentation of men. And then finally, progress measures. So it's for all well and good to get women into your university, but do you ensure that once they are there, that they are supported either to complete their education or, in the case of your faculty, to ensure that they have ways of progressing throughout the university in an environment which is free from harassment and free from inappropriate behaviour. So hopefully that gives you an overview of the kind of things that we're looking at in this particular example. And we've done the same kind of thing for each of the SDGs, sometimes more detailed, sometimes at less detail, depending on how that SDG relates to universities. But let's look now, I've got about 15 minutes left. Let's look now at some of the outcomes of this. What data do we see out and what does that tell us about the methodology? Overall, last year we had 860 universities participate and 776, I think it was, made into the overall ranking. The top ranked university in the world was the University of Auckland from New Zealand. But one of the concerns I always had when I was undertaking this exercise was that if we generated something that essentially just replicated what we saw in the World University Rankings, where the usual suspects came at the top, then perhaps we wouldn't have been successful. So I did a comparison. This is just looking at the top 100 from the World University Ranking, remember, research focused, and comparing that to the top 100 from the impact ranking. And we do see some signs that this is actually reaching out beyond the usual suspects. The US is far less represented in terms of the top universities in terms of impact compared to the World University Rankings. We see a university from Africa in the top 100. We see 3 universities from Latin America in the top 100, and many more universities from Asia. So this suggests that actually it hasn't been a complete failure from that perspective. We are starting to see different universities being able to showcase what they are doing. And this is even more so when we look at individual SDGs. For example, SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, is an area where Indian universities significantly outperform where we would expect to see them in the World University Ranking. So that's quite healthy. If we look at gender equality, we looked at that just before. Again, we see a similar pattern. If we compare the impact overall in the top 20 against the top 20 for SDG 5, we're seeing that, yes, universities in Latin America can perform there. Universities in Asia are also performing well there too. And one of the interesting things is that universities from the Middle East are very keen on submitting data around gender equality, even if they don't necessarily perform especially strongly in it. So there is also an indication that universities are trying to reflect where they're working, even if they acknowledge that they are perhaps performing not as well as they would like. And that brings me on to this idea of a difference in which universities are choosing to submit to which SDGs. Because you can choose, remember, we would expect to see an uneven pattern. And what we see when we look at all submissions is that the 2 most popular SDG 3, good health and well-being, and SDG 4, which is quality education. Perhaps no surprise here, our medical, our medics all go through university. I hope they do anyway. So universities have a link there directly. And also, obviously, universities are involved in education, although it's worth remembering that SDG 4 talks firstly and foremostly about early years education and lifelong learning, far less about traditional university settings. But I can use this as a baseline now that I see the overall pattern, and I can see how much more or less universities in any particular region submit to individual SDGs. When I look at Europe, what do I see? Well, we are far less likely to submit data around SDG 1, which is no poverty, and SDG 2, zero hunger, and SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. Perhaps not surprising, Europe is a relatively wealthy part of the world, and these are not necessarily the issues that are front of mind for our universities. Conversely, we're much more likely to submit around the SDGs, SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth, and SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And of course, that is pretty much the definition of the European Union. The Treaty of Rome talks about those very things. So it's interesting that our European universities tend to reflect the issues that are relevant to both Europe and the European community. If we look at Asia, though, we see a very different pattern. Now we see SDGs 1 and 2 being much more significant. SDG 6, as I said, led very significantly by universities from India, and also SDG 9, which is industry, innovation, and infrastructure. In that case, universities from Japan, universities from South Korea, which traditionally have very strong links to industry, are leading the way there. So it turns out that my hypothesis that we would see this very different pattern from different parts of the world tends to be reflected in the data, and that's very interesting to note. In my final 10 minutes, though, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the changes we've made and some of the key dates for this year's data submission. The first and biggest changes that we've made, which is at the request of specific universities, in our first 2 years, we had really focused on undergraduate only institutions, or sorry, not undergraduate only, but universities who had undergraduates. We did have a few postgraduate institutions who chose to submit in the knowledge that actually the questions we were asking weren't always designed to reflect them. We've actually decided to allow postgraduate only universities to participate. And as a result, we've rewritten some of the definitions, hopefully not to change the way that universities of undergraduates would submit their data, but actually to expand them to make it clear to postgraduate only universities how they can answer the questions. We've changed our entry criteria. We did ask that universities were accredited. Now, in many countries, that's very straightforward. There are, however, some parts of the world where accreditation is a lot less clear. And instead, we've adopted a new approach, which says that we expect a university to be in good standing. That's something I would expect is true of every single university on this call, but it will give us the ability to exclude universities if we believe that they are behaving in ways that are not in alignment with the expectations of the academy. The final thing we've done in terms of the entry criteria is much more pragmatic. We are asking universities when they submit data to define the limits of the university. Now, for most universities in Europe, that's fairly straightforward, but there are some parts of the world, for example, in the United States, where you have state universities that have multiple campuses, often have associated research institutes, they may have hospitals that are linked to them. And we just want to be clear about when you're submitting the data, which are the components that you're including and which are the components you're excluding. We've also worked hard to try and provide additional guidance in the data submission information. We've done some internal work around naming consistency. It turned out we had, in some cases, 4 different names for the same measurement. We've tried to make that more consistent. And very importantly, we are now taking an approach which says we publish the full methodology in advance of data collection. So you can see the full methodology now. Previously, the way we did it is we would gather the data and we would publish the ranking. And at that stage, we would say, and this is the way we've done the calculation. So we're trying to do this to try and be more transparent and open to universities. And we think this is a very positive step forward. Hopefully, we've also made the data submission portal. So this is the online mechanism for universities to submit data. We tried to make that more user-friendly. I hope you'll agree, but if you don't agree, again, please do tell us and we will try and improve that in the future. And we also now require universities, this applies to American universities, I'm afraid, to submit data in metric units only, because it was very challenging for us to interpret whichever various imperial measurements they'd chosen to use for different questions. We have made a few specific changes to specific questions. I'll not dwell on them at the moment, other than to say, usually these were around questions where we were asking for how much of something do you have? In this case, for example, SDG 2, we asked a question about food waste, and we were asking essentially how much food waste do you generate? The difficulty we found was that some universities were saying 0, not because they produced 0 food waste, but simply because they didn't measure it. So we've now split these types of questions into 2 questions. The first one is, do you measure food waste? And if people say yes to that, then we ask about the amount of food waste that they generate. You can only receive a score for the second part of the question if you answered yes to the first one. So we hope this is going to result in much higher quality data, but also a way of encouraging universities to measure things such as food waste, which we think is really important to measure. Same is true for SDG 6 in terms of water usage. Do you track water consumption? Some universities do, some universities don't. And then we ask about the amount of water that's consumed. 6.4, we've had to simplify a little. So this was in terms of water reuse. We found that this was a particularly challenging question for universities to answer, particularly in situations where water may be reused multiple times. The Asian Institute of Technology had a long call with us where they explained how they reuse water in an agricultural system. And that clearly is quite challenging to measure. And so we've simplified this to say, well, do you have a water reuse policy? So are you committed to water reuse? And then secondly, do you measure it? Next year, depending on the answers we get to this, we may be able to go back to asking that additional question, how much water do you effectively reuse? A similar point on question 12, on SDG 12 around waste recycling. But then I think quite an important change around SDG 13 and in terms of a university's commitment to carbon neutrality. We asked this for the first time last year, and we asked it in a very simple way. We simply said, Are you committed to carbon neutrality, and what is your target date for achieving it? That was very interesting. We got a range of different answers. Most universities, it turns out, are still aiming for a target date of 2050. We hope that universities will consider having a more immediate target date. But this year, we're actually expanding the question to ask around the different scopes of carbon neutrality, because there's clearly a huge difference between a commitment to a scope 1 carbon neutrality and a commitment to scope 3. So we're asking universities, which scope of carbon neutrality are you targeting? And then what is the year of the target for achieving that, if you are at least targeting scopes 1 and 2? We think this is going to be a really interesting data element to be able to analyze and understand. We hope we will also be able to encourage universities to set more ambitious targets in the future. And in SDG 17, I'll not spend time on this, we've simply chosen to ask the question in a slightly different way to make it hopefully easier to understand, both from a scoring perspective and in terms of what we're asking for. And here what we're really asking for is your university specifically measuring targets, whatever they are? They don't have to be the targets that we're looking at, but are you measuring and reporting on progress against specific targets associated with specific sustainable development goals? A few key dates. We are now in data collection. Data collection opened on the 1st of October. A data collection will close, we hope, at the end of November. If we had pushed it later than that, we would have hit first the Christmas period and then into Chinese New Year in January. Also, because we're expecting many more responses this year, this means we need more time for data evaluation and validation. And that can include coming back to universities when we have queries about the data they've submitted. The goal is that the ranking will be launched on April the 23rd, possibly in a physical meeting. I suspect more likely at the moment it will be a virtual meeting. And if you have any specific questions about it, do please contact us on impact@Times Higher Education. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. I do have a few links which I will put into the chat about how you can become how you can feed into the Elsevier process, and how you can check up on those keywords, and also where you can download the methodology from. So I will work on putting those into the chat in a few minutes. I'd also like to say that I've been working together with the United Nations Higher Education Sustainability Initiative around some guidance that we're going to try and produce. Well, we've produced it, that we're going to publish around how people can try and interpret assessment techniques such as the impact rankings. There'll be one set which is aimed at users of rankings and assessments, another one which is focused on helping universities understand if they should choose to participate. And I think we've tried to be balanced there and say, you know, there are positives and there are negatives about being involved in an approach like this. And then finally, a set of guidelines for organizations like Times Higher Education who are producing them. So we will continue that work, and hopefully we'll be able to publish that soon. And EAUC has been part of that body, and Fiona has been very helpful on that. So thank you so much for listening to me for so long. Do we have any questions? And Claire, how are we going to handle this?
Okay, so I'm just going to keep an eye on the chat. We've already had a few questions in, so I'm just going to read them out. Once we come to the end of the questions that are on the chat, if anyone would like to verbally ask a question, do pop your hand up. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's an option to just put your hand up. So just go through these first, and then if anyone has got any verbal question they'd like to ask, we can do that way. I'm going to start with quite a generic question from David Hogan from University College Cork, and you may not know the answer to this. How many universities are expected to take part this year?
That's interesting, because I'm constantly being asked that question by my boss. So I'm going to, and I haven't said this publicly before, so this is a genuine EAUC inclusive, yes. So I'm a bit nervous about this, which is why I'm hesitating. So I would be hugely disappointed if we don't get at least 1,000 universities to participate. Okay, so that would be my bottom line. I would be crying into my Coke Zero if that were the case. I suspect we will get about 1,200. That would be where I think things are going to be, but it's always very difficult to tell. My stretch goal, this is where I would be absolutely over the moon. If we got 1,528 universities to participate, then I would see that as being a triumph. And for those of you who don't know why 1,528, the answer is because the World University Rankings, which we've been running since 2004, now has 1,527 universities in it. So if I could get to a stage where this has greater participation than the World Ranking, I would be especially delighted.
Okay, great. So a question from Katie McGuire, University of Leeds. Much of our evidence from last year will be the same this year. Policies are still relevant or haven't changed, and examples are still relevant. Is this okay, or do we have to submit all the evidence again, or just the data that has changed?
So the answer is that if the evidence is still relevant, and in the case of policies, it may well be, then you should, and I must admit, I haven't played with this in the portal at the moment, but my belief is that you should just be able to copy that across from last year to this year, and the portal should be set up to help you do that. But certainly that evidence is still valid, and it should be straightforward to do that. Obviously if your policy has been either reviewed or updated, we want to know about that, because that's one of the things we think is important. Policies that are reviewed or updated more regularly tend to be policies your university is actually implementing rather than simply sitting on a shelf somewhere.
Great. So Patrick Clark from Solent University, where and how does the date of policy creation review, where and how does the date of policy creation affect the ranking or the scoring?
Yeah, so it goes back to exactly what I was saying. So we have no problem with you having a policy around gender equality, which was written in 1967. That's perfectly fine. But if you haven't reviewed that policy within the last 5 years, you won't score as much for that. And the logic from that is simple. And by the way, a review doesn't mean you change it. A review simply means you look at it and you make sure that it's still fit for purpose. I've been involved in city councils, I've been involved in not-for-profits, and it's absolutely the case where you have a policy that you never look at, the chances are you are not actually living that policy. So that's the idea behind that, is saying, make sure you review your policies regularly. Now, anecdotally, a university that I shan't name, I will just say it's an Australian university, found exactly this. They found a policy from the 60s that they hadn't reviewed since then. And the first line of that policy is, we will review this policy in 1 year's time. So it's always worth checking through. As I said, we're not dogmatic about this. When we say policy, by the way, some cases you may say a policy isn't appropriate for this because of legislation. In those cases, we want to see the practice. What is the way that you implement that legislation in your particular university to ensure that you're abiding by it? But the goal is to say, do you have the thing in place that ensures that you are living up to that expectation?
Okay, great. Question from Andrew Bryers at Aston. Our university won't sign up to this as there is no negative press for not being included. Is there a way to league those who don't submit data, or more communication sent to VCs asking them to participate?
Interesting, and especially since you've said which university you're coming from. I should emphasize that my first job was on Aston Science Park, so I'm a big fan of Aston University. I had wanted this year for our World University Ranking to have a little logo beside each university that had chosen to submit to the impact ranking as well. And I think, unfortunately, we couldn't get that built in time. That's the approach I'd like to take, is basically a way that clearly separates those who have chosen to participate in the impact rankings from those who don't. I don't think we should set up a shame list, because there are good reasons why your university might choose not to participate. Rankings aren't for everyone. We had a call yesterday where Julian Skirm, who's the head of sustainability from Manchester University, was very clear about this. He said, look, don't participate in a ranking unless you are very clear about what you as an institution might get out of it. And sometimes that's just publicity, and that's perfectly fine. But I hope with this particular ranking that it might also be able to help your university move forwards in terms of their sustainability agenda. But whatever it is, if you don't have that logical reason for participating, you shouldn't have to participate. So I think naming and shaming possibly isn't the way. I think building up a enough positive press around it so that universities are going to be asking the question, why aren't you in this ranking? Or alumni might be asking the question, or members of your faculty might be asking the question. I think that's probably the best way to go. Although we could create the Aston University shame list if you really like.
Okay, two questions kind of along similar lines. One from David Suchfield on the University of Andrews. Will the impact ranking methodology be incorporated into the World University Rankings ever?
I'm not certain about this. When we asked this very question at our World Academic Summit, and I asked it at pretty much every summit, we saw I would say about 90% of people in the room we were talking to said no. They said that the world ranking should stay focused on research. Now, having said that, I think there is almost a sea change. I think what I've seen over the last 18 months is a significant change in the relationship between universities and the Sustainable Development Goals. Many more universities are starting to use them as either frameworks for their strategy, or they're seeing the value of reporting what they're doing against them. So perhaps that will change in the future. I do think there will be huge complexities about how do you go from something that is so big and so all-encompassing down to something that we could fit in alongside the research elements of the World University Ranking. So my feeling at the moment is possibly not. I prefer to grow this ranking. I prefer to have this standing by itself, also because I want this to reach out to universities who can't participate in the World University Rankings, universities that just don't have the same research focus, that maybe are more teaching focused. And I think that's particularly important when we look at parts of the world which have a very different setup than the setup we tend to see in Western Europe particularly. But I am open, so keep arguing for it if you want to see it.
And on a similar vein, will you be building in the new SOS/NUS carbon ranking just launched?
So we need to do stuff on a global basis. So we can look at this, and I have talked to people from the NUS Sustainability Office before. I should add, I stood as NUS president once and failed miserably. Stephen Twigg won that year. Whatever happened to him? So I'm open to looking at that, but I do need to have things that I can measure internationally. Now, I do think there's a really interesting question which doesn't really relate directly to that, but is about the issue of the involvement in students in university, and should students be able to give feedback. Again, the big challenge is how do I do that internationally? But I would say this is the only ranking I'm aware of where we ask questions about, does your university recognize a students' union? And we ask about participation of students in the governing structures of universities. So hopefully we're starting to look at that aspect of it, but I would recognize that we can do more in that area.
Great. And then a similar sort of on the similar lines from Rosina Watson at Cranfield University. Can you tell us to what extent students are or might be incorporating the impact rankings into their decision-making about universities? And what other stakeholders have you seen start to look at this ranking?
So there is some evidence that that students are starting to see this. Not all students. There are going to be some students who will look at higher education simply as, well, simply as a route into employment. Nothing wrong with that. But we are starting to see this as being one of the issues that is more important. And I think there's great work that people like NUS and the European Students' Union can do around trying to identify the extent that that is the case. We're also starting to work here at Times Higher Education with Apply Board, for example. And this is one of the questions I want to find out about international students. Is this an issue for them? So I think particularly the more switched on students are starting to explore this. We are seeing as well that alumni are starting to recognize this. Penn State University, the first time they were aware of the international student office at Penn State, the first time they were aware that they participated was when they were called up by their alumni talking about it. And governments. Now, different governments are taking different views, but we are directly working with two governments at the moment who are explicitly trying to use not necessarily the ranking, but certainly the SDGs as a framework for understanding the relevance of their university sector to their broader society. So I think that there are signs that there are a wider set of stakeholders who are starting to become interested, not necessarily in this ranking. You know, I'd love to think that this is part of the picture, but actually in universities as a mechanism, as a needed mechanism for delivering on sustainability.
Great. Okay, we've got a couple more. So this one's from Kate McGuire. It's been a very difficult year. Obviously, a lot has changed and there's lots of restriction, and the COVID restrictions have made a big impact. She says, giving us less time to submit isn't wholly welcome and might be quite ambitious, especially as you're expecting doubling of applicants, or hoping for. Is there a chance the deadline may change as per last year to account for this?
I think there's a limited chance. I wouldn't rely on it because, as I said, there's a kind of catch-22. Yes, we want more universities to participate. We've tried to make this more straightforward by publishing the methodology in advance. It was published actually at the beginning of September. So universities have had slightly more time to pick up on it. There's also fewer changes from last year, so we hope it's more consistent. The difficulty we have is that if we push that deadline back much, then we just can't hit the data validation process. We can't go through that in a consistent and fair way. I think a particular challenge we have, of course, is that if we're asking about outreach, we expect that to be in the local language for the university concerned. It would be crazy for us to expect that an Indian university would produce outreach material in English. And so we have to make sure that we're not just assessing it in terms of the question, we're also doing it across multiple languages. So I wouldn't say there is too much flexibility on our side to do that. You know, if you have a specific issue at your university, please do contact us directly, and we'll see what we can do. But my operations director, who isn't actually in the office today, I'm glad she's not, because she would be hitting me over the head if I even hinted that we could move from that deadline.
Okay.
And I'm expecting her to drive in just to hit me over the head now.
There's just a quick reminder to everyone from Fiona that your Sustainability Leadership Scorecard report and your SDG Accord report can be used for evidence of SDG 17. So hopefully that's helpful, just in terms of not filling in two different sets of information. Question from David Hogan from University College Cork. Do you think the methodology will bed down in the coming year or so? Some of the data points required are not currently being gathered by universities, and it would be useful to know if this type of data will form the basis of the ranking going forward.
So I think it will. I don't think we will anticipate many major changes next year, but, and this is always the caveat, there are two reasons why we might change. So I think we've now in a stage where we understand the data much better. We understand where the data issues were. So actually three reasons why we might change. So the first one is we find out from the data we receive back that there's clearly, we're asking the question in the wrong way, or universities aren't able to produce good quality data. So that's one reason. But I think that we've probably minimized that. The second reason would be if we were approached by universities saying, actually what you're measuring is really unfair, or is really biased, or has these unintended consequences. Now, there is one great example of that in SDG 8. One of the things we ask universities about there is the proportion of their employees who are on short-term contracts. And this is really trying to understand the issue of precarity of employment in higher education. Obviously, as universities have been financially stressed this year, some of them have had to make redundancies, and it's typically easier to make redundancies of people on short-term contracts than people on long-term contracts. So do we want to have a situation where we could end up effectively rewarding universities for firing people? And I think the answer is no, we don't. So we're going to need to think about potentially some metrics in light of COVID. But the third and final reason we might change is a positive one. If we get to a stage where the vast majority of universities are saying, yes, absolutely, we have a policy on something, then we'll stop asking about the policy and start asking about the implications of the policy. So, you know, this is an acknowledged weakness of what we're doing. Ideally, we'd be trying to measure outcomes, but it's very difficult to measure outcomes in all cases. This is a general problem that not-for-profits face as well. And so in too many situations, we're measuring either inputs or outputs. I would like to move us along eventually towards outcomes. So when everyone is saying, yes, we've got the inputs, we start trying to ask them about the outputs or the outcomes instead. So, but having said that, as I said, probably pretty stable from year to year going forwards with those few exceptions.
Okay, we don't have too much time left, but I have got two more specific questions which have been put forward. As citation data is input in the background, does all the citation data get uploaded even if you only select the 4 SDGs for entry?
So we can see that, yes. I mean, we don't include it in the ranking, obviously, but yes, we're able to see that. In fact, you're able to see that if you have a Scopus subscription, then you can go into Scopus at the moment and you can see the papers associated with your university that are associated with each SDG. If you don't have a Scopus license, or a Scival license, you can still take the keyword search and you can apply that to Web of Science, or you could apply it to Microsoft Academic Graph or Google Scholar, and you could get something that would be reasonably consistent. So yes, we can actually see that, but we don't use it in the ranking itself.
Okay, fabulous. Right, and one last really specific question, just based on the gender example that you gave in your presentation. How is senior position defined?
So we actually define that in the methodology document. So we try and give clear guidance. It's a good example, by the way, of a measurement which requires a lot of cultural context, because if you talk to a German university, they would and just said senior position, they would have a very different definition than, say, if you talk to a UK university or an Irish university. And so we've tried to be as clear as possible about what it means and what type of roles are included. So obviously vice chancellors, presidents, deans, it's that kind of level. But please do read the documentation. And if it isn't clear to you, please do talk to us, because every time a university comes back to us and says, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that question, that enables us to actually provide better guidance to every other university who's in the same position. And it helps us expand that and make that absolutely clearer.
Right, that's pretty much all we've got time for at the moment. Thank you so much, Duncan, for all the information that you've given us, for answering all the questions. For those of you who have joined us, really great that we've had so many people on and this is of such interest. If you wouldn't mind just taking just a quick minute to open up your Slido on your web browsers. It's actually sli.do, leave out the .com, and just pop in THE ranking. And just let us know what your feedback on this session, and also you've got an opportunity to just let us know if there are any other things that you would like the EAUC to be talking about, anything that you think is relevant that you would like to hear about. We're more than happy. I do hope a lot of you will be joining us at our conference in November. We've got an amazing program planned and lots of workshops, so hopefully we'll see a lot of you there. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And this will be available on the Sustainability Exchange. We'll send you out the link just so you have access to that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you, Claire.